Okay, we're looking at sectionalism today, and this is going to lead us into, after the reformers, into the events that lead us up to the Civil War, and that'll take us, closer and closer to the South seceding from the Union, and that'll be the start of the Civil War in 1861. So a lot of definition, a lot of vocabulary terms here. Sectionalism. Sectionalism is the loyalty to a part of the nation, but not the nation as a whole. So a Southerner found himself more closely tied to that region and his brothers down there than he did to the United States of America. Same with Northerners. They tended to have more allegiance towards the cities than they did towards their Southern brothers. And this is going to eventually, it may take us 30 years to have it boil over, but this is going to be what ends up leading us to the Civil War. What caused sectionalism? Well, people live in different regions with different weather, with different economic social systems that drive their economy, and that's going to bring about different lifestyles with different social structures and customs and political values. The South and agriculture is a Protestant region that is a much slower paced life. It's an agricultural setting, whereas the North is more of a urban setting. A lot more immigrants in the North, much more of a urban setting, so it's more congested. Not a lot. I mean, you're not going to run across snow in the South, and you're not going to run across a cow pasture in the North, or not in a lot of the major cities. One of the big ones that will really cause people to have harsh feelings is the Southerners feeling like the Northerners were attacking and trying to change the Southerners' lifestyle. Again, you can look at this today and you'll have certain people within the factions of I'm conservative or I'm liberal, I'm blue, I'm red, I'm liberal, I'm conservative, that say that one or the other one is trying to change their lifestyle. And both of them make complaints and yell real loud about how the other side is trying to take something away. And it's just so obvious. And my gosh, can't you see what the other side's doing to us? And that's going to really boil over again, and that's going to cause the Civil War. Now, sectionalism and the expansion of slavery is what causes the Civil War. Again, say it again. Sectionalism and the expansion of slavery is what causes the Civil War. You're not going to have the war being fought over freeing slaves until after the war has already started. So that's a misnomer if you've been told that. Let's go through the events of the Civil War, and we're going to go back just 40 years. The first one that we're looking at is the Missouri Compromise, and that was in 1820. And the Missouri Compromise, if you remember, we've acquired the Louisiana Purchase, we're moving westward, we're taking on states, and you have northern states that are opposed to slavery, southern states that want slavery, and it was a compromise in Congress that decided that anything above the 36th parallel, if it was going to become a state, it would be a free state. And then anything below the 36th parallel would be a slave-owning state. Now, this gets a lot of attention, and I think a lot of it is based off of, like we didn't come up with a very good solution. But I would point out that the solution that they come here with gets 30 years of get out of jail time. We don't have anything happen until 1850. And yes, it doesn't solve the problem, but it gives us a solution temporarily. It's not at the right solution. The right solution was going to require probably a war. The only exception to this rule was, and we learned this last unit, was in our westward expansion, was Missouri itself. It entered as a slave state even though it was above the 36th parallel. and they had been working, and Missouri wanted to enter as a slave state, and so they allowed that to happen. 1831, you have that Nate Turner's Rebellion, as we looked at from our book. This is a slave rebellion in Virginia where white slave owners, there's like 60 of them on several plantations that are killed, and then they are caught, these slaves, and over 200 of the slaves are then hung and killed and beaten. And this causes a great deal of fear from the slave owners themselves, and it causes slave owners to treat slaves themselves much harsher, and then it becomes tensions rise between northern states and southern states with runaway slaves. Next is the 1846 to 1850, the Wilmot Proviso, and this was a piece of legislation that was designed to make it where any lands from the Mexican War were going to be free slave states. And Mr. Wilmot is a Democrat in the House of Representatives, and he tried to pass this legislation. Well, again, the South is saying, wait a minute, the Texas war with Mexico is below the 36th parallel, so that should become a slave state, and so should any of the other states that are going to come about below the 36th parallel based on the 1820 Missouri Compromise. Mr. Wilmot and the House of Representatives were trying to pass legislation that was going to say, no, that wasn't. And again, this is where the South now in 1846 to 1850 starts to see this and says, you are trying to change our life. You're trying to change our lifestyle. Again, I'll use the illustration of today. You have a 5-4 Supreme Court justices that are conservative. If a Supreme Court justice that is liberal retires or dies, Mr. Trump will appoint a conservative, and that'll make it 6-3. With a 6-3 decision on that, you'll see some rather controversial topics come possibly back up for review. That's going to cause a lot of people to say you're trying to change our life. And that lifestyle may have been something that's been in place for a number of years. But that's the best or closest example I can give you to what the Southerners were feeling like the North was doing to them. In 1850, you're going to have the Compromise of 1850. And the Compromise of 1850 is, again, another series. It was a piece of legislation that a guy by the name of Henry Clay was trying to pass. He couldn't get it done, so it looks like, man, this thing is really getting, it's smoking hot, and this thing's going to boil over into war. But a guy by the name of Stephen F. Douglas, who will run up against Abraham Lincoln in 1860, he is able to get the South and the North to come together and agree on a series of bills that he passes. And what the South ended up getting out of it was that they got the Fugitive Slave Act amended that placed slaves that escaped and people that were giving them safe passage. Those people were prosecuted against in free states. Again, slaves are property. If my horse gets out and it goes over to your barn or your field and you try to keep it, that's my horse. Okay, that's the way they were looking at it. And that's what the South got. The North conceded in a piece of legislation that the South would get those slaves reparations for the slave that escaped, and if somebody was trying to hold them, they would be punished. The North got that Washington, D.C. would abolish slavery, and then California was admitted as a slave-free state. Now, California is an interesting one because part of it's above the 36th parallel, the northern part, but most of it's below the 36th parallel. And the South gave up California and admitted it as a slave-free state. The next thing that they did was they said that new states being brought into statehood would have popular sovereignty, meaning that they would have the right, the state themselves would have the right to decide which way they would go. Would they be a slave state or would they be a free slave state? And that's a big one. States' rights is a huge process in this continual battle of discussion between the legislators. Finally, the last one we're going to talk about is in 1852, there was a book written called Uncle Tom's Cabin, and it's a fictional book written by a woman by the name of Harriet Beecher Stowe, and it's an anti-slavery novel. And it's important because the people in the North, when they read this, it gives a vivid picture of what and how slaves and black people were being treated solely based on the color of their skin. And it really, really charged the people of the North to say this is ridiculous. And it's going to be a big factor of bringing on the Civil War. And some people say that's a good thing. Some people would say, maybe that's a bad thing. But nonetheless, it's another factor that leads us into the war. People that read that, like the South would read it and see it very differently than what the North was seeing it. And again, this is cousin versus cousin, brother versus brother. So those are a few things that we're going to look at. We're going to stop there right now, and we've still got about 4 more things we're going to take a look at. But those are the 4 things we're going to start with some of the events that lead us up to the Civil War.